All right, we're here with Abra Berens, who's the executive chef at Granor Farms in Three Oaks, Michigan. We are truly in Michiana right now. We're like a stone's throw away from the border. I saw on the map driving out here, right?
Yeah, your phone might pick up Central Time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we're that close.
So we're here on location in her house. She was so kind to invite us to her house, where she has recently written, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but she wrote earlier, well, I can say last year, 2019, she wrote an amazing best-selling cookbook called Ruffage. And we'll talk more about that, but everything was shot here, so we are here connected to that. And while all of our other podcasts have been in Ann Arbor, and Abra has extensive Ann Arbor ties, we decided to go on location here. So thank you for having us.
Thanks for making the trip.
It was fun. We're having a good time. So anyway, one thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that serendipity. We've had a couple stories like that. And we actually knew each other in college. Mm-hmm. We had some mutual friends. We went to school around the same time. Yeah. In many other episodes, I've dated myself over and over again, but I won't state it in this one. We went to school some time ago, not too long ago, and then both of us stuck around Ann Arbor for me for longer than you, but you were there. Worked at Zingerman's for quite some time. Yeah. We had mutual friends through there as well, and then we didn't speak or anything. And then randomly, I was in a store in Chicago, Stock Manufacturing. Mm-hmm. Shout out to the guys at Stock. Yeah. And you walked in, and it was like we said hi, reconnected. It was totally like happenstance that happened. Yeah. And became Facebook friends like old people do once they meet each other. Facebook is not exactly cool, but we became Facebook friends, and that's where I learned what you were up to and all the cool things you're doing, and that's why we're having this podcast. So I just thought, cool background to the story of why we're here. Well,
it's always, Ann Arbor was such a formative time, so it's always so nice to reconnect, and I think it wasn't until after leaving U of M and Ann Arbor realizing what community comes out of that just by the virtue of the university and the location of it. So it's a treat to have you here and to be hearing what you're doing and telling these stories. So thanks for including me.
Of course. So tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, school, what you studied in Ann Arbor, and then how you got into food.
So I grew up in Western Michigan, about 20 miles south of Holland, Michigan, and I grew up on effectively a pickle farm. My grandparents on my dad's side were farmers. My grandmother was a school teacher. My grandfather was a farmer, and my dad both my parents were anesthesiologists, and so we were kind of a mixture of farming and medical family. And my dad went to U of M's medical school and met my mom in Ann Arbor as well. She was working at St. Joseph Hospital, so it was always kind of like I knew of Ann Arbor and those sorts of things. And
your family had fond memories of Ann Arbor.
Yeah, exactly. But there was never any legacy pressure to attend school there. But then when I applied to different schools, that was the place where I knew I wanted to go. And so I ended up there and studied history and English. I felt very lucky to be able to do both, mostly because I've always loved history, but then for English, I think I found the bulk of my community on a program called NELP, the New England Literature Program. Okay, yeah. It's a spring term course that the English department offers, where you move to New England and study transcendentalism while living a very pared down lifestyle. So
like Thoreau style.
Exactly. Okay, yeah. There's lots of Walden studying and things like that.
After the podcast, we should talk about whether you watch Dickinson.
I haven't.
We'll talk about it. Okay. Sidebar.
Yeah. We read a lot of Dickinson. It's funny because I also love Charles Dickens, and every time I say it, I have to have a pause where I'm like, which one is it?
Dickens, the son of Dickens.
Yes, the daughter of Dickens.
Got it.
And so Yeah, so I had started working. I've always worked in restaurants since I was 16. I think every farm kid to a degree is just itching to get their driver's license so they can work off farm for a bit. So I've sort of found my way there because I had a family friend who had worked there, maybe 10 years beforehand or something.
Oh, wow.
And so I kind of knew of it. And then I happened to stumble into Zingerman's twice and was it wasn't the part of Ann Arbor that I ever lived in or anything like
It's
that.
still not the usual place. A lot of college kids, I think,
They
never
don't
make it to Zingerman's except for maybe senior year,
Yeah,
graduation,
I
things
don't
like
know
that.
what
Right?
that is
Yeah, I
about
don't know it
that
either.
part of town, but yeah, anyway, so I just sort of happened I was on a long walk one day and I stumbled into it, and then a few months later I was like, "Oh, I'm going to stay in Ann Arbor during spring and summer term, so I need to get a job." And I thought, "Oh, it might be a good place to work." And then I fell in love with it. And Zingerman's, I think, was, maybe the most important life turn for me, because it taught me so much. It bred a love of food, sort of a nascent love of food that I had already had. Because my family were big eaters. We always meals together were really important. But then also I went from, it just taught me what I wanted to do with my life, which was to be a part of small businesses, and the leadership and the servant leadership ideas and community of businesses and all of the ethos that Paul Saginaw and Ari Weinsweg espouse rang so true to me. Right. And then that's also where I started cooking. So Roger Bowser, who was my chef there and is now a managing partner, really kind of took me from the front of house into the back of house and created a space where I could learn. And then from there, he connected me to Ballymaloe, which is the cooking school where I attended in the south of Ireland, which was also maybe the next most important thing, because it really changed my ideas about what it would mean to be a chef, or the connection of farming and food, and how to bring those two things together. And I never would have found my way there. At least I don't think, you never know for sure, but Zingerman's made that possible.
And how long were you in Ireland studying?
It's only a 12-week program.
Oh, wow.
So I was in Ireland and the UK for 3 months total, or I'm sorry, 6 months total, but in school for 3.
Got it.
And Darina has continued to be a very sort of magical force in my life. And so I feel like starting at Zingerman's, there were so many times where people, it's not fairy godmothers, but that sort of idea, people just helping put you on a course that was going to, take what they saw in you and sort of expand upon it.
Right.
And I just feel so grateful that, Zingerman's made that place for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's I think it's one of the things that, when I was younger in business, it was when employees left on, moved to other things, it was always I wish we would be able to keep everybody. But what Zingerman's taught me a lot about was alumni. That's it. We talk about alumni, but having a broad network of alumni is awesome, because it provides growth options, but it also provides this breadth of experiences and people to talk to and jump onto.
Yeah, it truly is a community, and it's also a community that's founded on some sort of commonality,
Right.
And if that's, I think U of M does that really well.
Yep.
The alumni associations do that really well. But yeah, you have some sort of shared foundation that makes the language that you're speaking to each other make more sense, or it's contextualized in a way.
Right.
Yeah.
And when did you leave Ann Arbor?
I left Ann Arbor in the fall of 2006,
Okay.
and that's when I went to school in Ireland. I was in Europe for 6 months, and then I moved to Chicago. My now husband is from Chicago, so we were in Ann Arbor at the same time, and then he moved home, and I moved to Ireland, and then I moved back to be with him.
Got it.
So then I was cooking in Chicago for a bit at different farm-to-table restaurants and bakeries, and then another former Zingerman's person and I reconnected about the idea of starting a farm together. So Jess Peace Corps and I started Bare Knuckle Farm up in in Northport. His family is from Sutton's Bay, and they had some family land. So we started farming vegetables there with the goal of having on-farm dining. At least that's where I came into it. That what I was seeing was that there were fewer and fewer people were really connected to the land and where their food came from. And so thinking like how better to do that than to, have a meal take place right where the food is grown. And it was kind of a, sort of like, I wonder sometimes about all these like little throwaway ideas that you have, but then if you expand on them, what they become. Right. And that's what I feel like this sort of idea of experiential dining has been for me. It was like this idea that like, I don't think people are realizing where their food is coming from. Let's show them by having like a nice night out, and then what that has sort of led to. So we farmed together for several years, and then I was still commuting between Chicago and Northport, which is like a 5.5-hour drive. So that is not a great way to set up.
What did that week look like for you?
Well, thankfully it was sort of every 6 months. Oh, okay. So I would move up in the spring and then come back to Chicago periodically throughout the summer, but then I would move back in the fall and then cook all winter. But even with that, it was hard to, you can't move up in a restaurant if you leave every 6 months. Right. And so it felt like a not totally sustainable way for me to continue to grow my career. So I ended up moving back to Chicago and helping open a restaurant called Local Foods, which I thought would be very similar to cooking on the farm because they're a food distribution business. So they were getting all of this amazing product from Midwestern growers, and then we were pulling from that to run the cafe. But I really missed that connection to the land itself and from one grower. So I started thinking about wanting to be back in Michigan and just kind of going back and forth on how to do that, how to make it happen. And then we have some friends who have a flower farm in this area in Three Oaks. And so Eric, my husband, and I came one Labor Day, I had the day off from work. And so I thought, let's just go and help out on their farm. And so we did that. And then as we were driving around, I was like, maybe we could live here. It's only 60 miles from Chicago, but we're in Michigan. It's very rural. There seems to be a lot of like great growers and all those things around. So
there's such an activity around, breweries, distilleries. I mean, there's a definitely the intersection of business and the land is here for sure.
Yeah, it's a very vibrant part of the state, I think. Yeah. So I was kind of thinking about this area, and then I was doing an artist residency up in northern Michigan, and so I left my job for about a month to travel up there and just like do some work. And my friend, who happens to also know the owners of Granor Farm, had heard that Granor wanted to do a chef residency program. So they were talking about like, we'll just have different chefs come out, do a couple weeks of events, and then, nobody permanent sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So I got this pitch deck and was like, this sounds great. I would love to do this. And then the more I thought about it, the more I was like, this seems like so much work for someone to have to like orchestrate and like all the variabilities that different chefs bring and how to market that. And I realized like maybe they just want to hire a chef. And I happen to want to move to this exact town. So I just, said I would love to do this. I also happen to have this background in on-farm experiential dining. Maybe we can talk. And then we ended up talking and realizing that we just wanted to work together. So
that's great.
Yeah. So I started at Granor in the spring of 2017 and have been back in Michigan since.
And talk a little bit about developing a program like this. I mean, it's the second or third time you've done it, but this time, maybe it wasn't your startup or you're coming into the community. And the farm had existed for some time now already? Yeah,
Granor Farm started in 2009, and so they have been a part of the community for a long time. So I certainly benefited from the relationships that were built by Rob and Liz, the owners, and Katie Burdett, who's the farm manager, and their relationships to the community. And so I think what the nicest thing about it was like second or third time starting kind of a program where it was like, we're really going to truly be telling the story of a farmer through a, dinner or whatever, was that I could take the lessons learned and apply them. So I just knew what had worked for us in northern Michigan, and I knew the things that didn't work. And so I wanted to like try to fix some of those things. So what we do is we host dinners pretty regularly every 3 weekends out of the month from May until February. And we create 7-course menus that are they start out with looking at the ingredients that are available on the farm.
Oh, interesting.
And so it's a lot of chefs, I think, kind of think up flavor combinations or dishes and then find the ingredients to make that thing. I go about it the other way. So it's looking at the ingredients that we have and then, creating a structure of a 7-course menu around that. So we don't release the menus in advance because oftentimes the menus change the day of the meal because, something will come in and it's just perfect and we have to include it, or something that we thought we would have that was going to be harvested doesn't look as great, so we don't want to include it. And then also everyone eats the same thing. So we wanted to create a sense of community around food because the farm is, it started to be a farm camp for kids. And cool. So we do 3 weeks of farm camp, which is ages 5 to 10, come in and they do participate in all parts of the farm. And then also the farm is a 100-member CSA, which is community supported agriculture.
Right.
So it was those two things that were unique to Granor that I wanted to, sorry, my dog just walked in the room.
Yeah, your dog walking in, and Mason is not paying attention to us and taking a picture of the dog, which is quality producing, Mason. Thank you.
And so, so those were the kind of two things that education, community, how to connect people to what we're doing that made me really kind of shape the program slightly differently. And so we have 3 tables and we mix different groups. So if you'll sit with the people that you, like if you bought, 4 tickets, you'll sit with your 4 people, but you'll be at, she just wants to be a part of the whole thing.
Come on in.
And so you'll sit with those people, but you'll also be at a table with other people. And so there's a lot of kind of sharing and passing of platters and things like that. And so, hey, Zuma, come here. She's like, I already know you. I don't need to. There you go. Yeah, just chill out. There you go. So that's what we do. So it's 1 seating every night. Everyone eats the same thing. So we really tailor it to people's dietary restrictions. If we have a couple people who are gluten-free, we'll just make a whole gluten-free menu. And that way people don't feel excluded in that way. And they really get to see kind of where the food was grown. That is a part of their meal. And the reason it feels really important to connect people to how the food is grown, my program couldn't exist without the farm, and without the farmers who are doing that work. And so wanting people to see this is one way to farm. I grew up on a very different farm that was much larger, industrial. She's very nosy.
Yeah, she is.
So I grew up on an industrial farm, which was hundreds of acres and big equipment, and we grew, 1 thing or 2 things or whatever. And there was no traceability from the pickles that we grew to the jar of Heinz relish.
Right, yeah.
And that's fine. I think that there are farms. We need farms of that size. We need all types of different farms. We need really small farms in urban centers. And Granor is another way to look at it. It's a biodiverse farm. We do a lot of soil management because we have very clayey soil, so how to make that ever more fertile and things like that. And so just wanting to give people kind of a window into what we do feels really important.
That's awesome. And so you how did was a cookbook always in the picture, and how did that even come about?
Oh yeah, it's funny. That's, I feel like, another thing about Zingerman's is that they focus a lot on visioning.
Yeah.
And kind of helping course set, I guess. And so I don't know, 10 years ago or so, I was kind of thinking about what would I want my long-term career to look like. And I really love cooking and I really love farming, but they're also both very physically taxing jobs. And so there's some window in which you start to not be able to do a farmer's market at 6 a.m. and then cook a dinner that night that goes till midnight and then get up the next day and do that whole all over again.
Yeah.
And I thought, I always loved writing, and that's why I was an English major, and I love telling stories of food and growers and ingredients. And so I started writing a food column for the paper in Northern Michigan, the Record Eagle, and Allison Batdorf and Nate Payne really made space for me on their pages to give me a place to be writing. And then I thought maybe someday we would take all those columns and, kind of zip them between 2 covers and be done with it. And or that would be a nice thing. Yeah. And so I hadn't really thought of a cookbook in quite the way that Ruffage came about. But what ended up happening was that my really good friend Tim Mazurek had put me in touch with his friend Kari Stewart, who's a literary agent, and she had been reading some of my columns and just reached out and said, have you ever thought about a cookbook? And the columns sort of evolved. They started out just, I knew I wanted to write them. Zuma, please leave him alone.
They're good.
Let me go back a little bit. When I started writing the column, it came out on the same day that our most poorly attended market happened. And so I was like, oh, maybe I can use this as a way to like drum up business.
Yeah,
so,
right.
So I wrote, I would write the column about a particular ingredient and just, either two different ways to prepare it or, same preparation method, but different flavor combinations. And that was kind of the like structure of the column. And so as I started putting together the ideas for the book, that was sort of followed that path. So it's 29 vegetables that we grow in the northern Midwest. An opening essay that's very similar to how the column was, and then different preparation techniques, and then different flavor combinations. So I always kind of describe it to people as like an NCAA bracket, but in reverse.
That's awesome.
So you start with the winner, which is the vegetable, and then there's different preparation techniques. So if it's asparagus, like, raw, roasted, and grilled.
Right.
And then for each preparation technique, there's a recipe, and then there's 3 different ingredient combinations or flavor combinations. And the idea is that we grow the same things year after year, but they don't have to, that redundancy doesn't have to be boring. It can be sort of a structure off from which to create something. Yeah.
Great. And in focusing on vegetables, which I know Ruffage completely focuses on vegetables.
Yeah.
Is there any thought to, was there any design behind that in terms of like, a movement to kind of, cut meat consumption down? Is that part of it or not? Or it's just, I really wanted to focus on vegetables and no ulterior motive there.
I mean, I think they're sort of intertwined in the sense that when I first started farming, I kind of came of age as a cook in the time when Fergus Henderson and nose to tail eating was very like in vogue, and it's what everybody was really focused on. And so I also was focused on that. For those of you who can't see, Zuma just dropped a bone. She just wants to be a part of this in any way she can.
She's going to make it. She's going to make the cut.
She's like, what? Pretty soon she'll just start howl barking at like a deer or something. But yeah, so I was very focused on meat when I first started cooking, and then we started farming vegetables. And I found that if we're going to write a menu based on what we're growing, that means it's going to have a lot more vegetables in it than I was normally cooking with. And then the craziest thing happened, which is that we were also extremely broke because we started this farm, which is not a high margin industry.
Right.
And so we were eating what we were growing mostly, and I was eating more vegetables than I ever had. And then I went back to Chicago and was working at a pie shop for Thanksgiving and was eating a ton of pie and drinking a ton of coffee. It was like salamis and cheeses and just like suddenly felt bad.
Yeah.
And so had like I went to the store and got a bunch of carrots and kale and things like that, and I just felt so good. And I realized that my body had changed, and I just wanted to eat more vegetables. And then started to find, after that realization, there's so much more in common between a steak and a pork chop and a chicken breast than there is between a stalk of asparagus, a tomato, and a winter squash. But that's vegetables.
Right. All vegetable.
Right.
Vegetable. Yeah.
And so it's like when people say like vegetable forward eating, it's like, yeah, but there's so much diversity in that one class. And so, I started just really diving into that, and it's what I knew the most of. And I think the best advice I had gotten about writing was write what you know and write the way that you speak. And so that's what I did. And that's kind of where it went. And then, thankfully, I think we are having more conversations about plant-based diets and the sort of climate impact of
right.
meat and dairy. I still eat meat, I still eat dairy, but I do think that I feel better. I think I'm healthier, and I think our planet is healthier, and our agricultural system is healthier when we eat more vegetable-based diet.
That's great. And it was so well received. Top cookbook for 2019 in the New Yorker, New York Times, and 100 other places that I don't actually know the ins and outs of, but I know the New Yorker and I know the New York Times.
Right? Which isn't, it's just so funny. Like, what an honor. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And as awesome. Someone who, I think that I felt this way at Michigan sometimes too, where that was the first time I realized that the sort of coastal mindset, I guess is the way to put it. And I remember someone at Michigan being like, there's no culture here. This is why we're like a flyover part of the country. And it's like, what does that even mean? And so, but I think I realized that's a real thing, that, you know, there aren't that many Midwestern food writers or people who aren't based in New York, San Francisco, or LA. And so I didn't really expect anyone to care about this book, because vegetables in my mind have already been, you know, kind of, people have gone through it. I mean, there's Josh McFadden and Mark Anthony from Gramercy Tavern have all written these beautiful vegetable books. So I was like, I'm kind of coming late to the game, but it didn't seem like there was anybody from the Midwest, and that there were very few books written specifically for home cooks. I think that's sort of the natural trickle down of food world. It starts in restaurants and then makes its way down. And so yeah, that's kind of, I guess I just didn't expect anyone to really think much of it or to care much about it. And so it still feels like such an honor that someone besides like my dad is reading it, you know, and then let alone to have people like Helen Rosner of the New Yorker and Kim Severson of the New York Times and Christina Shea from Bon Appetit and David Tamarkin from Epicurious. Like, those are all people who are really pushing the conversation of food and food culture in a not fluffy, not cutesy way. And I'm just eternally grateful.
I mean, it's such an awesome story. I've followed along over the years so intently, and I love how it's come around, and then I love how it's playing out continuously in your life, because you're at Granor Farms and still applying the things that you're writing and reading to what you do. So
I feel so fortunate to have been able to choose this line of work, and that it feels very fulfilling. I was reading something about the percentage of people in the country that feel like, just like in general, like unfulfilled by their work. And I think that there's lots of reasons to have a job, and certainly not everybody needs to work at a passion project. And there's lots of reasons to not work on a passion project, correct. Including like, you know, salaries and health insurance and things like that.
Real life.
Yeah, exactly. And just location, you know, things like that. But I do feel very fortunate that it feels like all of the kind of disparate threads of what I've worked on over the years have now been sort of woven together into something that's like somewhat cohesive. So that's
awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us and taking time. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
and
thanks.
Zuma is going to be a star.
I'm surprised she didn't like come through on like a unicycle juggling. She's just desperate for the limelight.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course.